Welcome to Just Us, a podcast about racial reconciliation and justice.
Our theme text comes from 2 Corinthians 7:2. Make room for us in your hearts.
Today's topic is we're going to be looking at two important terms that help us understand the racial reality and issues of our day. Sundown towns and GreenBooks. We release new episodes on the first of every month. You can find us wherever you find podcasts, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or Google. And we ask that you give us 5 stars and subscribe. We'd love your feedback, comments, and questions. You can find us at washingtonconference.org/podcast.
And I hope you enjoy this episode.
Amen.
So we're going to start with John Brunt as he describes an aspect of his childhood hometown and talks to us about sundown towns.
What are sundown towns? Well, they are municipalities where people of color were not allowed to reside, but not only that, they weren't even allowed to be within the city limits after sundown. Thus the name Sundown. These began back at the end of Reconstruction, 1890s, 1900, and lasted officially up until 1968 when the Federal Fair Housing Act passed. However, the passing of that act did not mean that all these towns immediately held out a welcome mat for just anybody to come. So they extended on beyond that official end in 68. They were scattered all over the country. The Northeast had a lot of them, the Midwest, the Northwest, here where we are, the West. And, for instance, just the state of Illinois had over 500 of them. So there were many, many sundown towns across the country. Now, in some cases, they were official, where there were actually laws on the books that stated this. In other cases, it was unofficial. The way they communicated that they were a sundown town also differed significantly. In some, there were actually signs at the city limits. Very unwelcoming signs, I might add, in many cases. Others had symbols rather than signs. One of the symbols that let people know it was a sundown town was a black mule, for instance. Some towns had alarms. There was a town in Illinois, for instance, that put a big alarm up on top of their city water tower, and it went off at 6 o'clock every evening to signify that all people of color needed to be out of town. Others, it was simply unwritten and everybody knew it. The enforcement was different. In some cases, it was simply by intimidation. You didn't dare stay there, and the intimidation could become quite fierce. In some cases, even to the point of not only cross-burning, but burning down homes and lynching. In other cases, the enforcement was official with the police. Now, the city I grew up in, Glendale, California, as far as I know, didn't have any signs. At least I never remember seeing any. But everyone knew it was a sundown town, and the police enforced it. If a person of color was in town after sundown, the police would stop, they would pick the person up, and they would drive them to the city limits, either to the east or the south, at the city limits of Los Angeles, and drop them off there. Couldn't go to the north because that was the mountains, and couldn't go to the west because that was the city of Burbank, which was also a sundown town. And the fact that these sundown towns existed created all kinds of opportunities for discrimination. For instance, in the city where I grew up, there was a large city swimming pool. It's where I learned to swim. There was a sign when you went in by the cash register where you paid your money that said, "Open to residents of Glendale only." Now, they never cared whether you were from Glendale or not. Nobody ever looked at your ID when you walked in to see if you were really from Glendale. You simply paid your money and you went in. However, since no people of color could live in the city, then if a person of color walked in, they could say, well, you're not a resident here, and they would be denied entrance. So it opened up opportunities for discrimination, not just in swimming pools, but in education, in employment, in various government services, and so forth. This was not a secret, by the way. In fact, a lot of these towns blatantly bragged about being sundown towns. It would be in their promotional work. There's a city in Illinois that's name is Anna, A-N-N-A. They drove all people of color out in the early 1900s, and then for decades they advertised the fact that A-N-N-A stood for Ain't No N-Word Allowed. Another city actually had a promotional brochure for the city, and it said it was a great place to live because it had 7 churches, 2 public schools, 1 academy, 1 sanatorium, an ice packing plant, and no saloons and no N-word. And all the way up into the 50s and 60s, there were real estate developers that would advertise that this was an all-white development. If you want to know more about them, there is a very good book by a man named James Loewen, L-O-E-W-E-N, called Sundown Towns, A Dimension of American Racism. It has lots of detail. He has been criticized by some for having so much of his material rely on oral accounts, but he defends himself by saying most things were oral rather than written down. And he's done a lot of interviews with people. There's one very interesting thing in the book. It's under Note 1, a link that you can click on to a website he has, and it gives you a map of the United States, and you can click on any state, and it will list all the sundown towns that were in that state, and then when you click on a town, it will give you the dates and the specifics and generally some anecdotes. And you can click on a state and see what cities that were a part of your history that were actually sundown towns and when they were. Now, it's been 52 years since the Fair Housing Act, and so that's before some of you were born, and that could mean we're just talking about ancient history here. But I think we should talk about what kind of effects these have had, and do we see legacies from sundown towns still making a difference in our world today? I think that'd be a good place to start talking about these.
Incidentally, John, my mother grew up in Glendale, California, so I have roots, sadly, I have roots in that sundown town as well. So how do you see this affecting us today?
Well, maybe somebody else wants to start with that. I have some ideas, too.
Well, in my lifetime, growing up in, spending a part of my teenage years in Brooklyn, New York, I don't know if it would be called a sundown town, but there were certain parts of the city where people of color just wouldn't go for those same reasons. And it comes to mind a young gentleman, a teenager named Yusuf Hawkins, 1989. I remember I was in high school in Brooklyn, and he went over to another part of town, which is predominantly white town. I don't remember if it was Howard Beach, or I can't remember the name of it, but he went over there to check on a car. And as he was leaving, it was getting into the evening hours, he was leaving, some, I would call the rabble-rousers across the street saw him, okay, leaving in their town, and went after him and beat him to death for just being there. And that sat with me for a long time, because it could have been one of my brothers. We all lived in New York, They didn't want him there. He didn't belong. I don't know if they've done that in broad daylight, but that wasn't the first incident that has happened while I lived in Brooklyn about people being in those wrong neighborhoods at the wrong time. So that stayed with me for quite a while.
Well, you know, I think the history of sundown towns lent itself to that kind of violent action, because if you dehumanize people as other and consider it a threat for them even to be around, why then it naturally leads to violence. Well, I grew up about 2 blocks from Glendale High School. I didn't go there, I went to a private school. But before I was born, actually, this happened. The Glendale High School football team had a game with a team from Pasadena at John Muir High School, and it ended up that the John Muir team had an African American on the team, and they beat him to the point where he had to go to the hospital. And I'm sure that kind of thing happened much more. We know about that incident because the football player who got beaten up grew up to be one of the most famous athletes on the planet, not in football, but in baseball. It was Jackie Robinson.
Yeah. Wow.
Wow.
Yeah.
I have a question. When you were speaking, what stood out to me was the signs that you were speaking of, and one of the signs you said was a black mule. What's the origin behind that?
Well, it's not a nice origin. The expression that it was supposed to represent was, don't let your black 3-letter word be in this town
Wow.
after dark.
I see.
Got it. That was very clear. Wow.
That's interesting.
And you know, we think of this as ancient history, but as late
yeah.
as 2006, not that many years ago, 2006, a major manufacturer in the United States was building a new factory. And they could not say, of course, that they wanted an all-white workforce. That would not be legal. But they decided to build their factory in a town that had historically been a sundown town, and still, as of the 2000 census, had no people of color in the city. They built it there. It was 50 miles from a metropolitan area and the nearest people of color. After they built it, they made a rule. They said they wanted their workforce to live near the facility that made for better employees. So they made a rule that you had to live within a 35-mile radius of the factory in order to work there. And so that ensured them an all-white workforce without them having to say that that's what they were doing. So the legacy of those sundown towns lives on.
I wonder what this did to the soul of America in the sense, you know, you think of hospitality and welcoming people is a Christian virtue, and to have communities where it forced to the point of violence, certain people were not welcome. You wonder there had to be people who knew this wasn't right, and there had to be shame, generational shame, in the sense we're not living up to the Christian, because America has a strong Christian. What do you think this did to the soul of these communities to behave like this?
Oh, well, we're seeing that now, that America has no soul. Especially looking from a Christian perspective, where's the soul of the church in these instances, you know?
Right.
How did they embrace those people who are disenfranchised and marginalized like that, or chased out of town at 6 o'clock in the evening? You know, who was there to welcome them back or welcome them in? And to me, it seems like there was a deterioration long before then for this to be allowed to happen, you know? And I don't know that it's healed.
Right.
I don't know if it will, the soul of America, can we reclaim it? What can we do to not let these kinds of things happen, you know, to people who lived in places like Glendale at the time, or in Illinois and Anna, Illinois, or, you know, I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question. Like, what happened to the soul? It deteriorated, it rotted.
Yeah, unfortunately, even Christians have quite an ability to rationalize and justify. And
Yeah,
we
they
can see
do.
that easily as we
Yes.
look in the past. It may not be as easy when we look at ourselves,
Right.
but I suspect that there will be a time when people look back at us and are just as chagrined, as we are. But it was within
Chagrined.
the churches
Yeah.
that they tried to defend from the Bible that
Oof.
blacks and whites were supposed to be separate, and that it was, and of course, even slavery was
Justified.
from the Bible.
Yeah.
So it was not that this went, it was from something outside the churches. This was supported and defended by church people.
But why do you think they did that? Why do you think they felt the need to defend those kinds of actions? Because you can't take certain scriptures out of the Bible and just use it to fit or to suit your lifestyle or your belief. A lot of us have done that in the past. Sometimes I have. And then you have to go back and rethink your philosophy. What does this scripture really mean? What's before and what's after? What does the context of the scripture mean for our lives? But I don't understand up to this day why that was why people put their societal standards over the scripture, because it seemed more important to say faith with society than with God. And it baffles me. Up to this day, people are defending the actions of an innocent black man being shot dead, or his, and well, why didn't he just comply or listen to the police? And they're defending this. And the Bible tells us clearly that is not, you're supposed to love your neighbor and do unto others as you would want them to do to you. But people are and they're defending these actions.
Right.
So I just don't understand that.
I think is to just the misunderstanding of scripture, right? That's basically what it is. People,
Is
and
it
we all-
misunderstanding or blatant disregard?
I really believe either, right. I don't want to defend anyone, but people take scripture, and if it fits for them, they take it, right? Yeah. So, I'm going to worship on this day, so this fits for me, or I'm going to take X, Y, and Z because it fits for me. So, within that concept, hence why you could have a racist theologian argue there should be separation of races, right? Or there should be separation of X, Y, and Z, and slavery was biblical and stuff like that. So the misunderstanding of scripture illuminates that ideology, like, okay, we are doing something right when we're actually doing something wrong. That's how I see it.
And I wonder if bringing things into the light. That's why I think it's important to talk about these things. It's uncomfortable to talk about them. I love America, and I'm embarrassed. This is part of our history. But if we bring things into the light, there's a phrase from the 12-step program. It says, "Our secrets keep us sick."
That's
And
facts.
so,
Yeah.
if we bring things into the light,
That's good stuff.
and if we realize, and because like you said, John, some of this was just the oral tradition. It wasn't spoken because people would be embarrassed if this was openly spoken. So I wonder if one step towards healing is bringing it into the light. Sure. Mm-hmm. Then we can say, okay, that wasn't good.
Right.
Let's address it. Let's move on, and let's be healthier as people.
When I think about biblical interpretation and how people see issues like this, I'll never forget a conversation that I had. This would have been in 1984, so it was a long time ago, with a black pastor in South Africa in the middle of apartheid. And I was there doing some teaching. He was one of my students. He came from a country near South Africa. I had students from about 9 different countries. And I remember him asking me after class one day if he could talk to me about a biblical question he had. And his question was whether people of color were under the curse of Canaan, which was a biblical idea that a lot of people use to justify racism.
Wow. Yeah.
And of course, I mean, I'm supposed to be a biblical exegete, so I sit down with him and I show him how that's absolutely not true, that interpretation is totally wrong. And I show him several reasons why it's totally wrong. I'll never forget, we ended the conversation and he said, well, it looks like you're right, but I'm still not totally convinced because I don't have any other way of explaining how terribly we're treated.
Dang.
Wow.
The actuality of that.
That's
Yeah.
the reality he's experienced. Because apartheid wasn't too different from, the civil rights movement, Jim Crow and all that. It wasn't.
In some ways, even worse.
Yeah.
I have two comments. The first one with what you said about bringing it to light, and I definitely agree with that, Bill. Not only bring it to light and make it known, but also dismantle the system that continually, I guess, what's the word? Hold that oppression, that system of oppression. I think that's what we definitely need to do. Bring things to light and then dismantle it and rebuild something better. And the second thing I would like to say is, since you grew up in that, right? I want to know more about it. Like, how was that for you with the Sundown cities? Did you have like black friends that actually, if you were playing with them, they had to go home, or like, can you give us more about that?
As I mentioned last time, I didn't, because there weren't very many blacks in town, I didn't have black friends up till I got into academy. And then there were, and had some really good friends. But it came with a friend of mine who had an African-American maid. And I can remember being at the house. I mentioned this story in a sermon a few weeks ago, and one of my classmates from years and years and years ago gave me a Facebook message and said, oh, I remember being in that home at the same time. And the thing I remembered about that maid was that when she made us sandwiches, she always cut the crusts off, and I really liked that. But I can remember the husband in the house coming in one night and saying, "My, I've let you stay here too long. Usually she took the bus home." He said, "You've been here too long. You're not going to be able to get out of town in time, so I'm going to have to drive you home tonight." But I will admit that growing up until, and I mentioned last time, a teacher when I was about 13, 14 years old really started opening our eyes to what was going on. It was almost as if, it was something that existed somewhere else, and we just didn't even think about it.
Wow.
Nice. Okay.
So what would we say to someone who said that was really unfortunate, shouldn't have happened, but we're in a different era now, and that's illegal? What would we say? You mentioned the factory, but are there any other residual effects that are with us today of sundown towns?
Well, I think one thing that we have to look at is attitudes. Have they changed? Well, they have, but they still have a long ways to go. 538, the outfit that does presidential predictions now and has been doing research for years, had an interesting piece of research where they showed, they asked the question of whites in America if they thought it was okay to discriminate on the basis of race in housing. Is it okay to refuse to sell your house to someone because of race? In 1980, 66% said yes, that was okay. So 2/3 of people. In 2000, it had gone down to 40%. In 2015, which was the latest record of this, it had gone down to 27%. But that's still more than a fourth of whites in the country who think it's okay to discriminate in housing on the basis of race.
Wow.
Hans and Mimi, do you mind if I ask? Hearing John describe this reality of sundown towns, like I said, my mother grew up in Glendale. So I can hear about it and I can say, "Wow, that wasn't the way God would have us be." What is it like for you hearing John describe that?
Well, it's upsetting. It's disappointing. It's, I don't know, it is embarrassing. Because people aren't, we're not, this is not who we're called to be. We're not called to be, separate because the way you look or the way I look. We're called to be separate from sin and worldliness, but we're not called to be separate from one another in that way. And it kind of reminds me of how we're supposed to be when I think about, Acts chapter 2, that, the latter half with the community of believers and how they fellowshiped with one another and uplifted one another. How they put their resources together and they welcomed people who were outside of their lines. They welcomed them in to fellowship with them, and they dwelt together. And this is just not the way we're supposed to be. I don't believe that at all. And I think a lot of people use the Bible to speak to what they think is right. And when I visited the Bible Museum in Washington, D.C., I did see those slave Bibles. And it's incredible what they've done to pick and choose verses to keep people oppressed. And that's not what the Bible is about. And I think we've just fallen very, very, very short, of what's required of us.
I would say, hearing about this, it definitely dawns on me how, let's say humanity does its thing, right? But when it comes to Christianity and how Christianity let these things happen, it dawns on you like, yo, if we as so-called Christians should be the body of Christ, right? And we supposed to be all loving and all caring, yet we fall in the same thing as what the world is doing. It's crazy how we let that happen. And we treat each other the same way. And I feel like it still lingers till this day, I could tell definite stories, but that falls on the red line, and so I'll just wait for that. But yeah, I don't know. It's just it's daunting to the fact that those who are supposed to uphold the values of Christ, allows these things to happen. And if we're reading the same Bible, what do you not see? Or what is it that you're not seeing, that how if Christ came to this world, and when he came to this world, he put everyone on an equal playing field.
He did.
So it's daunting.
So we're going to transition, but I want to, before we do that, is there scripture that comes to mind that kind of lifts up our minds above the reality or the philosophy of Sundown Towns? I think of the one where in John 1 where it says, the Word, Jesus, became flesh and dwelt among us. Jesus came from heaven, a very elite community, and moved into our community. So heaven's philosophy is not, okay, a Sundown Town exclusive, you can't come in. Heaven wants to open the doors, and that's what Jesus is about. Anyone else, any scriptures or something like that?
One thing that comes to mind for me is the Sabbath commandment, not in Exodus where we usually read it, but in Deuteronomy 5, the second giving of the law. And there it talks about the reason for keeping the Sabbath being that we were slaves in Egypt and have been liberated and set free. And then it talks about how because of that, because we recognize that in Jesus we were all slaves who have been set free, we are to open the door to the stranger, even the foreigner in our gate. And when Sabbath comes, we're supposed to let them rest just like we do, because they're on the same plane as us. We are all equal when we remember that we were all slaves. We have all been set free by Jesus Christ. And that means everybody is a brother and sister.
Wow.
Yep.
So we're going to transition. So Hans, tell us about the Green Book.
All right, I got a story to tell. So let's bring it back to let me make it personal. So in 1997, right? 1997. My boys and I. Okay, when I say my boys, is I don't have any kids. It's 1997. One. Two, is the lingo that we use. My boys mean like close friends of mine. So whenever I say my boys, yes, no kids, none of that stuff. Till this day. So my boys and I, we were just talking, and we were very close. And we was like, yo, when we get older, we're gonna rent an RV and go on cross country, right? And that's one of the things that we wanted to do. And my boy's like, yeah, we're gonna do that. Like we had to have the big RVs with the beds and yada yada, all that stuff. So that was the goal, and it's still the goal to this day. So I know everyone loves like cross country, or not let's not say cross country, but road trips. Certain people love road trips. If you have the best person for the road trip, you like it, right? If you driving with certain people that you like, you have the person that's on shotgun that has the music and people looking out. If you speeding so the cops don't come get you. People love road trips, right?
Yeah.
I actually kind of love road trip if I'm with the right person.
Yes.
So let's just have that mindset. It's like road trips are fun. And the reason road trips are fun is because you see different places. You see, so when you go to certain stops, you just go outside, take pictures of this monumental moment or wherever it is, this attraction. And another reason people would love road trips, or what I would love road trips, you stop at different restaurants and you can eat whatever these people, whatever you like to eat, or these new kind of fancy foods. That's one of the things people like about road trips. And what's another thing? Oh, and if in road trips, you want to stay at like the fanciest hotels if you're that type of person, if you bougie, you know what I mean? You want to stay at the fanciest hotels, like 5 stars, everything is just catered to you. These are the reasons certain people love road trips. So now let's paint a picture. Like in the early 1900s, let's say 1920s, people would start going road trips. The highways were created, and people could do cross-country road trips, stop and take pictures, stop and get something to eat, stop and just do things, get some souvenirs, That was good. That was the American dream around that time. Having the ability to own a car, and not only own a car, but go cross-country and stop and just see the world, see America, right? Because the highways were built and everything was nice. But that wasn't the American dream for everyone. You know what I mean? And that's what the sad part was, because although Black people did own vehicles, African Americans did own vehicles, but they didn't have that luxury to stop and see and have the benefits of what white people had. And that is heartbreaking. Why? I'll tell you. So around the early 1900s, let's just say mid-1930, 1950, jobs were good. People were owning motor vehicles, and everything was seeming right. And as I told you, for white people, right? So it couldn't be the American dream, it's the white American dream, because Black people at the time, they had their money, they had their businesses, some businesses, and they also had vehicles. But the thing is, when they were going to road trips, they couldn't stop, right? So they couldn't stop to get these nice fancy foods, or stop and take these fancy pictures, or stop even at hotels. And that is mind-boggling because if you're going on a road trip, you need to stop for gas. You need to stop if you need to use the restroom. You need to stop if you're hungry.
That's right.
Right? This is things that we right now we don't really think about. But back in the day, what? It was hard for black people to stop because if they stopped, not only would they be be cursed out or called the N-word or whatever the case might be, they could actually die.
Yeah.
What? Just to stop. So certain gas stations was only whites only. Restaurants, white only. Even attractions, if the police would see you, even trying to take a picture next to certain nice attractions, memorial places, you could be stopped and beaten to death. And so this guy named Victor Hugo Green, and he decided he worked at, this was 1932. He worked at a post office. And then after he started working at a post office, he realized that all of these things black people could not do. So what he did was he still worked on the post office. However, he became a personal traveler agent, right? Just the simple fact to see where black people could go. So he created the Negro Motor Vehicle Green Book, short in terms, the Green Book. I know a lot of people seen that movie, and it is a good movie, but if you go in depth with it, I think you should. You will see the hidden truth about that. So he created the Green Book. He published the Green Books. And what he found was fascinating because out of 100 motels, black people could only visit 7. Including restaurants, including like let's say your car stops on the road, certain places black people can't go, and all of this thing. So he created this Green Book because at this point, black people started getting killed, and all of this devastation just for stopping somewhere. So as we know, like when you're going on a road trip, you pack certain things or pack light or heavy, however you want to call it. But black people at that time had to pack extra. So they had to have extra gasoline in their car. They had to have places, extra food. Even sometimes the food was spoiled because, the heat and all that stuff. Yep. Extra food, but they still had to eat it. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? So they had to pack that extra pillows so they could sleep on the roadside, if anything. And canned food, that's what they would use to use the bathroom because they can't stop at gas stations to use, like, stuff like this. So Victor Green did this Green Book in 1936, where it was published, and every year it would update to see where else black people could go, but out of 100, only 7 they could land. So this point, the Green Book actually helped certain black people say, okay, so we can't travel this far because if we travel this far, things will happen. Bad things will happen to us. We will lose our lives just for traveling. And it's not as if they didn't have the money to stay at the motels at that time. No, they did. They had finance. It's just that at this point in America, they could not. And it's heartbreaking to the point that even Martin Luther King, in his favorite "I Have a Dream" speech, spoke about the Green Book, and I don't want to butcher it or paraphrase it, so I'll read it to you. It says, "We can never be satisfied as long as the Negro is the victim of unspoken horrors of police brutality." It's still happening today. Mm-hmm. Then he continues and says, "We can never be satisfied as long as our bodies, heavy with fatigue of travel, cannot gain lodging in the motels of the highways and the hotels of the city." And Victor Green, he he worked and worked and published and published. And one of the progressive gas station was Esso. Right now it's called Exxon Mobil. They helped Victor spread his book, the Green Book, so black people could actually be safe when they drive, and black people could stop at ExxonMobil to fill up their tank.
Right.
So they really did. They were progressive in their time, and in the civil rights, 1963. That's when the Green Book became obsolete, because now the civil rights happened and people could come together. So that's great news, right? That's perfect news, because that means nothing happens anymore.
Right.
But I have another story to tell you. I hope I'm not taking too much time. But in December of 2017, one of my boys, again, that's one friend, one of my boys, he, what was it? He wanted to move to Seattle. So he's from Boston. He was trying to travel from Boston to Seattle. And he was driving with his brother, his twin brother, and another close friend was helping him drive. So they was driving. They was doing this long drive from Boston to Seattle. I wouldn't do it days. That's a long trip, right? So he was doing this trip. He was getting tired. They were staying in hotels, doing their thing, taking pictures, all that stuff. And then when they got to Montana, they got tired, and they wanted to stay at a hotel, a nice hotel too. And so they stopped. The boy, the friend that was in the car that was helping them drive, because there was two brothers and a friend, 3 people. The friend went outside and went to the hotel to, just check in. And the lady was extra nice. "Hello, how can I help you? Do you need a room to stay? This is about 2 a.m. in the morning." So that's, like throwing out the red carpet for this guy. So he was like, "Yes, I do." And then my boy and his brother walks in to the door. And at the moment they walk into the door, the lady sort of caught their eyes. And he asks the friend, "Are these guys with you?" And he goes, "Yeah." He goes, and then she goes, "We have no more rooms." Now, the nice person who she was with, you can only imagine he was a white man. So it was just like the whole red carpet, 2017, December, it's cold, right? And that whole trip, snow must be in the air, right? And at that moment, he was like, "What?" There was like, and she goes, "There's a motel down the road if you want to stay in. But right now, we have no room for you." 2017, 1963, that's when civil rights, all of that is done with. So we could go in hotels, but no. It still lingers today. So they go to this motel, and as they go to this motel, discuss the Motel 1, and they get a horrible treatment, the same, because they're still in Montana, the same kind of treatment down the road. And the lady, it takes 15 minutes to give him a key, throws it at him, and just he ends up going to sleep and doing whatever he did, and just comes to Seattle. And it's just mind-boggling to me that it still lingers till this day. The Green Book was published in 1936. And yet my friend is still having this treatment in 2017. So that's the story of Green Book. Black people had to have actually a guide to see where they could go so they won't be harmed and they won't die. Just so they could enjoy the American dream.
Hans, I have a question. When you see the movie, The Green Book, it seems to be all set in the South, and you get the idea that this is a Southern thing, but that's certainly not true, is it?
That is definitely not true, and hence why I told that story of my friend. This is Montana, right? Isn't it like 3 states across, 2 states across, however you want to call it? And it's happening still. It's prevalent still today. And yeah, in the Green Book, in the movie, you see everything is in the South. As they go deeper and deeper in the South, the hotels are getting more grindy, and it's disgusting. But nah, it's not only the South.
So, I like I said earlier, I'm embarrassed that I didn't even know about the Green Book until a year ago. I wonder, before the movie came out, how many white people in America knew about this?
They didn't have to know.
They didn't have to know. Exactly, because
Yeah.
why? You're not being oppressed, right?
Yeah.
And if it makes, sometimes I don't want to take this the wrong way, but I feel for them. Like, okay, they don't know, right? Because they didn't have to go through it. But just because you don't know doesn't mean you're not accountable to do
Correct.
something.
Absolutely correct.
I mean,
Right.
I understand that you didn't know. I understand that you didn't have slaves or own slaves. I get that, but yet you still benefit
Right.
from your ancestors or from generation after generation. You still benefit.
Right. You were privileged not to have to
know.
have a green book and
Right.
not to have to know.
Right.
So that's deep.
So I've read that one of the dangers of the road for black people was that they would have to drive straight through and they would fall asleep on the road, and because you need to stop and rest when you're doing or I can just imagine needing gas and like, okay, where can I get gas safely? I have to admit, it boggles my mind that a country, America, with such great democratic values, we talk so much about human rights, that this was part of our history. And I guess, again, maybe this is another situation of bringing it into the light. So you gave an example, Hans, of where this is not just an old story. There's some elements of it. Do any of you, the rest of you, have any other connections between where we are now and the reality of GreenBooks?
I don't know where we are now. We've lost our compass. The story that comes to mind was, it's not necessarily about GreenBooks, but similar to the experience of people, like Hans mentioned, driving across country and with the fear of not wanting to stop in certain places. Because my husband is Canadian. When I was in college, they would drive to Calgary, where he was from, and that was from Michigan to Calgary, and they had to drive through Montana, Wyoming, or wherever, and they would never stop in Montana. They would just say, "Hold it, we're going straight through," because these are black men. They were like very good friends. 4 of them would take that trip from Michigan to Calgary, and until they got to the border is when they could, they can breathe, but they never wanted to stop in Montana. And it's that when you said about your friend driving cross country, I'm like, oh my word, and they're Canadian in America, but that doesn't mean anything. They're not gonna, oh, you're Canadian, you can go on. No, they just see that you're a black, and so that was one of their, they would get to North Dakota or whatever, they put all their gas, get all their food, and just zoom through Montana. I don't, it just, again, how do we change that mentality? It's a change of heart, but there's so many people who don't want to change the heart. They want to keep things the way they are. What is the fear? What is the underlying fear? Is it a power? What is that? Where GreenBooks had to be created and Sundown towns had to be, created. What was that? And I don't know how we can defy that now. Is it too late? And I always ask that question.
Well, it's certainly true that, like you, both John, you and Hans pointed out that laws were changed. But you made a very important point, Mimi, is that you change the laws, there's still ways it can happen.
Yep.
When things happen in the dark, the laws don't always reach into the dark.
It's true.
And so a change of heart. So, we are believers. We're people of faith. What are the principles we can hold on to, that we can work under to build a bridge of reconciliation, to appeal to our communities and to our country for a change of heart, for God, to allow God to change our hearts so we can be better? Any thoughts?
I would.
That's a hard one.
Yeah, it is very hard.
Yeah.
Because the reason why it's so difficult, so hard, is because, Doc, we are believers, right?
Yeah.
They too are believers.
Yeah.
So it's just like if I'm a believer and they're a believer, what, like, we supposed to stay on the solid ground, but we don't like it kind of. The good old days, we're gonna keep it how it is, and so on and so forth. So what then? You see what I'm saying? Like, what then? What else is there to do? And especially if they have these blinders of racism, what then? I don't even know how to answer that question. Because they too believe.
And I really believe that we need to work to change hearts. We have to do it with the gospel. And I always think of what John Howard Yoder said in The Politics of Jesus, that Jesus doesn't call us to be effective or to be successful necessarily, but to be faithful. And so we have to be faithful whether we're successful or not, recognizing that Jesus himself was not successful with a lot of people. And so we have to try to change hearts, but at the same time, I think we have to try to change laws as well, and not rely on hearts, because there are people who will never change their hearts, and we need to find justice legally as well. And when you change the laws, it does eventually change attitudes, like that 538 study I mentioned. We're certainly not there yet, but at least over a period of, 35 years, it moved from 2/3 thinking that racial discrimination in housing was okay to 1/4. Well, 1/4 is way, way too many.
Right.
But if they had not passed the civil rights law, it would never have changed from 2/3 to 1/4. And so while we preach the gospel, always knowing that we have to be faithful in preaching the gospel, but we may not always be successful, I think we can't just rely on changing hearts. We also have to try to bring justice with our vote, with our voice, in changing laws as well.
I definitely agree. Because right now we have, an administration where there's a lot of laws that can be changed, but there's individuals who feel it's their right to sit on them and not get them through Congress. And because, the previous administration did this, so we're going to do everything to stop it. And that was very clear from the very beginning.
Wow.
And so when you sit and you peacefully protest, nothing that has been done to help change laws, right? It seems like it hasn't been effective. Because when you want to push something through, nope, we're not even going to address it. We're not even going to deal with it because it doesn't bother me. And I think that's a problem too. Yes, we are required to speak out against oppression and injustice. That is as Christians what we're supposed to do, because Jesus did it in so many ways. Every time he always spoke out against the authorities who had the law,
Right.
because they were unwilling to change it. He came and crushed everything that they believed in, and set the people free. And he did that when he was here on earth, and we try to do that now. But there's systems in place, right? And there's, like, you like to use the word stronghold, Pastor Bill.
Spiritual strongholds.
In place, right? That grasp that progress and pull it back,
Right.
And when we're in the streets, they say, oh, well, look at them. Oh, well, look at what they're doing. They're tearing this down. They're burning this down. And they want to change laws, And if the people in those positions of authority in our government, in our administrations, are allowing certain individuals to hold that down, how are we going to progress? What does it take? Do we arm ourselves in the streets because that is our Second Amendment rights, and go storm the government houses? What would happen to us if we did it?
Right.
One of the things that gives me hope is it's a very simple phrase, but it gives me direction. I can only clean up the garbage on my side of the street.
Right.
I can advocate for just laws, but at the end of the day, I can control how I act, and I can try to use my voice. For example, I've had conversations with many people, and who tell me, there isn't much racial problems. It's imagined or whatever.
Word.
And so I asked them, have you ever heard
can't.
of Sundown Towns? Have you ever heard of GreenBooks? Most of them never had. And our next podcast, when we talk about redlining and we talk about Black Wall Street, again, most have never heard of those things.
Right.
And so I hold on to hope in the sense that as people of faith, our theme verse for this podcast is 2 Corinthians 7:2, make room for us in your hearts.
Yeah.
That if we get a new heart from Jesus, then we can make room for other people, and we can also care about their lives. And so we are so glad that you have been with us today. And as we wrestle with this, as I said, next time we'll talk about redlining and Black Wall Street. And again, our goal is to work towards racial reconciliation and justice from a position of faith,
Yes.
and to bring things into the light and to be bridge builders and peacemakers. If any of you would like to communicate with us, I'm going to tell you the website. It's washingtonconference.org/podcast. And you can communicate with us with questions or things you think we should cover in the podcast. And we will be very glad to hear from you. Again, thanks for listening. And thank you to John and Hans and Mimi, and to Ernesto, faithfully recording for us.
Yes, sir.
And we will talk to you next time.
Next time.